The rain was a constant drumming presence against the windshield of Amelia's beat-up Ford Explorer. She navigated the winding, mud-slicked roads of Oregon, 100 miles from any recognizable town. The GPS signal had died miles ago, replaced by a static-filled radio and the eerie silence of the deep woods. For Amelia, a true crime journalist known for her relentless pursuit of forgotten stories, this isolation was a welcome companion. It was here, in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, that she was hunting for a ghost, not a spectral one, but a historical one. Her target was the Blackwood Timber Camp, a name that existed only in faded newspaper clippings and local legends. In 1884, 87 loggers had entered these woods, drawn by the promise of untapped wealth in old-growth timber. By the end of the season, only 6 had returned. The rest vanished without a trace. No bodies were found, no signs of a struggle. The official record listed it as an unfortunate but inexplicable tragedy, a tale swallowed by time. But Amelia had a hunch, a gut feeling fueled by a cryptic note she'd found in an archived journal entry, suggesting something more calculated. Her mission was to find the camp, document its ruins, and hopefully unearth some forgotten truth. She was armed with a high-end camera, a digital audio recorder, a compass, and a healthy dose of professional skepticism. She believed in facts, not folklore. The supernatural elements that clouded the legend, whispers of a forest spirit or a curse, were just noise. She was here for the human story, the brutal reality of what could have happened to 81 men. Amelia's sole contact in the area was an old, weathered man named Silas, who ran a remote general store. His directions were simple, almost dismissive. Head north till you hit the old logging road. Don't go past the marked tree, you'll find it. He hadn't asked her what she was looking for. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes, a mix of caution and resignation, told her he knew exactly what brought outsiders to this corner of the world. She finally found the turnoff, a barely there path choked with ferns and fallen branches. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet pine and decay. The canopy overhead was so dense that little light broke through, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The world shrank to the size of her headlights, highlighting the spectral shapes of towering Douglas firs. The road ended abruptly at a makeshift clearing. In the center stood a gnarled oak with a faded red ribbon tied around its trunk. This was Silas's marked tree. Beyond it was only untouched forest. Amelia killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water from the leaves. She felt a shiver, a sensation that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the quiet, the sheer crushing absence of life. The next morning, armed with her gear, she set out on foot. The air was crisp, and a fine mist hung low, clinging to the branches like gauze. Her compass needle spun erratically for a moment before settling, a detail she mentally filed away as a possible magnetic anomaly, a common occurrence in mountainous regions. She followed a barely visible trail, an indentation in the earth where wagon wheels and boots had once worn a path. She imagined the clamor of the camp, the shouts of men, the deafening thud of falling trees. Now, there was only the sound of her own footsteps, a stark counterpoint to the forgotten life that had once thrived here. After a few hours of pushing through thick undergrowth, she saw it, a clearing, larger than the first. And in its center, the skeletal remains of what had once been a logging camp. Rusted saws and axes lay scattered, swallowed by moss. The foundations of cabins were just crumbling piles of rotted wood. A rusted cook stove, its black surface flaking, stood sentinel beside a well that had long since dried up. It was a tomb, a physical manifestation of a tragedy that had faded into legend. Amelia began to meticulously document everything. She took photos of the dilapidated structures, the rusted tools, the remnants of a life cut short. She found a leather boot, its sole worn thin, lying half buried. As she photographed it, her eye caught something glimmering beneath a pile of leaves. She knelt, brushing away the debris to reveal a small, tarnished silver locket. It was open, and inside, a faded photograph of a young woman with a kind smile. A name was engraved on the back: Charlotte. She carefully placed the locket in a plastic bag, her mind already racing. Why would a logger have a locket with a woman's name and photograph? It was a common memento, but the simple act of finding it felt like a breakthrough. It was a tangible link to a human story. She continued her search, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As she was about to call it a day, she noticed something odd in the distance, a small, unnatural mound of earth that didn't belong. Driven by curiosity, she approached it. The ground was soft, covered in a thin layer of soil. Something about it felt wrong, like a freshly dug grave that had settled over time. She reached down, and her fingers brushed against something hard. She pulled at it, and a small wooden box emerged from the soil. It was sealed with an intricate, rusted latch. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was it. This was the buried secret, the one the legends couldn't explain. As she held the box, she felt a sudden, profound sense of dread. It wasn't the kind of fear she was used to. It was the primal, irrational kind that whispered of danger. She ignored it, her professional curiosity overriding her unease. This was what she had come for. This was the story she was born to tell. She took the box, carefully tucking it into her backpack, and began the long trek back to her car. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that somewhere, unseen, eyes were watching her, waiting. The sun was setting by the time she reached her car, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The beauty was a stark contrast to the unsettling silence of the woods. She got in, started the engine, and put the box on the passenger seat. She didn't open it. Not yet. She wanted to be somewhere safe, somewhere with a signal with a light on, but as she pulled away, she glanced in her rear-view mirror. The gnarled oak with the red ribbon seemed to loom larger, more sinister than before. She saw a brief flash of movement just beyond it, a shadow that moved too quickly to be an animal. A trick of the light, she told herself, a product of a tired mind and an overactive imagination. But as she sped away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't just found a box. She had disturbed a long-forgotten grave, and whatever was buried with it was not ready to be forgotten. The real story had just begun. The drive back to civilization felt endless. Amelia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, the small wooden box on the passenger seat a silent, unsettling presence. She didn't stop until she reached a small roadside motel, its neon sign flickering in the twilight like a beacon of sanity. The room was sterile and smelled of disinfectant, a welcome change from the earthy, decaying scent of the forest. With the door locked and the curtains drawn, Amelia finally placed the box on the small, worn-out desk. It was no bigger than a shoebox, its surface caked with a century of mud and grime. The wood was dark, likely mahogany, and felt surprisingly heavy. The rusted latch was intricate, a series of interlocking metal pieces that defied a simple tug. She carefully pried at it with the tip of her pocket knife, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears. With a final faint click, the latch gave way. She lifted the lid, revealing a small oilskin-wrapped bundle. The oilskin was brittle with age but had done its job. The contents were perfectly preserved. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal and a single folded letter. The journal's cover was smooth and well-worn, and the name Silas Blackwood was embossed on the front. A jolt ran through her, the same name as the man at the store. Could it be a relative, a descendant? The thought was unsettling. She opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the ink was faded. The date at the top read, April 12th, 1884. The entries chronicled the early days of the camp. Silas Blackwood, the author, was a surveyor, hired to map the claim and oversee the initial operations. He wrote of the beauty of the forest, the hard work and the camaraderie among the men. The tone was hopeful, almost poetic. The air here is clean, the work honest. 87 men, from all walks of life, bound by the promise of prosperity. I have never seen such a spirit of fellowship. We are carving a home out of the wilderness. Amelia read on, her journalistic detachment slipping away. She was no longer just reading a historical document. She was entering the mind of a man who had lived this tragedy. The entries detailed the routine of the camp, the long days of felling trees, the evenings spent singing songs around a fire. But a subtle shift in tone began to appear around the third week. A few of the men have reported a feeling of being watched. I have dismissed it as the isolation playing tricks on their minds. This place is far from any settlement. A man's imagination can run wild. The next entry was more direct. One of the young fellas, Thomas, claims to have heard faint whispers at night. Not in English, like the wind in the trees, but with a cadence. He's a nervous boy. I told him it was nothing, but I saw the look in his eyes. He is terrified. Amelia's skepticism warred with the chilling reality of the words. She flipped ahead, her fingers trembling slightly. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. Silas's handwriting became a hurried scrawl. The whispers are not imagined. The other night I woke to a sound at my cabin door. Not a knock. A soft scraping, like claws on wood. I peered through a crack but saw nothing. Yet the sound continued, moving around the cabin. A low, guttural murmur that defies description. Men are disappearing. First, it was Thomas. He went out to check a line and never came back. We searched for days, found his axe by a felled tree, but no other sign. A few days later, another man, John, vanished from his bunk during the night. The door was locked from the inside. This was the part of the story that had never made it into the official records. Amelia had only ever read about the mass disappearance at the end of the season. No one had documented the individual vanishings, the growing terror. Silas's journal was a raw, unfiltered account of the camp's descent into madness. The whispers. They are getting closer. They are inside the camp now. I am not sure if they are a sound or a thought. They speak a language I do not know, but I understand the meaning. They speak of judgment. They speak of us as intruders, as a blight on this land. The last entry was a single harrowing paragraph. I am one of the few left. The camp is a graveyard now, but the bodies are not here. I see them in the trees, in the shadows. They are not ghosts, not spirits. They are a part of this place. They are the forest itself, seeking to reclaim what we have taken. I must escape. I must get out and warn the others. But I am afraid to leave the cabin. The whispering has promised me that if I walk out, I will be consumed. I'm leaving this journal behind. Someone must know what happened here. Someone must know that we were not killed by man or beast. We were erased. The final words were barely legible. Amelia stared at the page, her mind reeling. This wasn't a story of a logging accident or a disgruntled rival camp. It was something far more sinister, a methodical and terrifying eradication. Silas's account pointed to a psychological and physical threat that was deeply rooted in the land itself. She placed the journal back in the box and turned to the folded letter. It was addressed to Charlotte, the same name on the locket. The handwriting was the same as Silas's, but the tone was different, full of a raw, desperate love. He spoke of his plans to marry her upon his return, of building a life together. The letter was a heartbreaking testament to the hope that had been stolen. As she finished reading, a sudden sharp rap on her door made her jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She froze, clutching the letter. Who could it be? She peered through the peephole. No one, just the long empty corridor of the motel. The knock came again, a bit softer this time, but with an unnerving cadence. 2 short raps, a pause, and then one long, deliberate one. It was the same rhythm she'd heard described in the journal. A cold dread seeped into her bones. She backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on it, her breath catching in her throat. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that she was not alone. The whispers that had haunted the Blackwood camp a century ago had found their way to her. She had disturbed the grave of a forgotten tragedy, and the thing that had swallowed those men whole had now set its sights on her. The game had changed. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a race for survival. The knocking at the motel room door stopped as abruptly as it began. Amelia stood frozen, listening to the silence, her mind racing. It was impossible. 100-year-old journal entry couldn't have been a premonition. The sounds were just a coincidence, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the eerie story she had just read. She took a shaky breath, forcing her rational mind back into control. It was late. Her imagination was getting the better of her. Still on edge, she spent the rest of the night poring over the journal and the letter. The details were seared into her memory. The name, Silas Blackwood. The whispers that spoke of judgment. The methodical way the forest seemed to consume the loggers. She knew she couldn't dismiss this as folklore. Silas's terror was too real, too visceral in his writing. This wasn't a story of a supernatural entity. It was a psychological terror rooted in something physical. But what? The following morning, she drove to the nearest town with a library, a small place called Astoria. The library was a musty, quiet building, its shelves groaning under the weight of local history. Amelia had a new lead: the 6 survivors. If Silas's theory was true, if the forest itself was the enemy, what had made those 6 men different? Why had they been spared? She found a dusty, handwritten ledger from the late 1880s listing local land transactions and historical events. She flipped through the brittle pages, searching for the names of the survivors. The official records from the local historical society were sparse, listing them as the Blackwood 6, men who had returned but were too traumatized to speak of what they had seen. But the ledger contained more. It listed their full names: Samuel Jennings, Walter Pierce, Thomas Croft, Elijah Vance, Peter Hayes, and Arthur Coleman. Beneath their names, a small, faded note was scrawled in the margin. It wasn't a description of their ordeal, but something entirely different. It listed the trades they had held before becoming loggers. Samuel Jennings, a land surveyor; Walter Pierce, a cartographer; Thomas Croft, a botanist; Elijah Vance, a geologist; Peter Hayes, a civil engineer; and Arthur Coleman, a lumberjack with a reputation for being a forest whisperer, a man who seemed to have an innate, almost unnatural understanding of the woods. Amelia's brain fired with connections. A surveyor, a cartographer, a botanist, a geologist, an engineer, 5 men who had an intimate scientific knowledge of the land. A lumberjack who understood the forest on an almost instinctual level. The 81 men who vanished were just brute force laborers. The 6 who survived were not. They were the ones who knew how the land worked, who understood its composition, its hidden rhythms. This wasn't a curse. It was a pattern, a terrifying, logical one. She pulled out her laptop and began cross-referencing their names with land deeds and historical maps. It took hours of digging, but she found a disturbing common thread. In the years following their return, each of the 6 survivors had purchased a small parcel of land. Not near Blackwood Camp, but in different isolated parts of Oregon. These were not properties for building homes. They were rugged, untamed plots of forest land, seemingly useless for any purpose other than leaving them untouched. Amelia's mind raced. What if the forest wasn't after them, but was communicating with them? What if the whispers Silas wrote about weren't a threat, but a bargain? A price for their lives. The price of their survival was to become guardians of the land, to ensure that the trees on their property were never cut. It was a horrifying, almost a mythological thought, but it fit the known facts. The survivors had made a pact. They were no longer just men. They were keepers of a secret, bound by an unspoken agreement with the forest itself. The silence of the library was suddenly oppressive. The old ledgers and maps seemed to hum with a secret life. She felt the same chill she had felt back at the motel room. The story wasn't just in the past. It was still alive, its tendrils reaching into the present. The descendants of the 6 survivors, were they aware of this pact? Had it been passed down through the generations? Her next move was clear. She had to find the descendants. She started with the most common name, Silas Blackwood, the author of the journal she found. The name had to be connected to the man at the store. He was the key to this century-old puzzle. As she packed her things, a thought struck her. Silas had told her not to go past the marked tree. He hadn't just been giving directions, he had been giving a warning. A warning from someone who knew exactly what lay beyond. He was part of the pact, a guardian of the land, just like the 6 survivors. Amelia drove back to the remote general store. The sky was the color of lead, and the rain had started up again, a soft, persistent drizzle. When she walked in, Silas was behind the counter, looking as old and weathered as she remembered. His eyes, however, were no longer resigned. They were filled with a wary, knowing light. He looked at her backpack, then at her face. He didn't ask if she had found what she was looking for. He simply said, "You went past the tree, didn't you?" Amelia's heart was a drum in her chest. She had 1,000 questions, but she started with the most important one. "Silas," she said, her voice low and steady, "I know who you are. Your great-grandfather was a surveyor at Blackwood Camp. You're a descendant of one of the 6 survivors, aren't you?" Silas's eyes narrowed, a mixture of fear and defiance flashing across his face. He didn't answer right away. The silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Some secrets," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper, "are meant to stay buried. You should have listened to the warning." Amelia didn't back down. "I found his journal," she said, pulling it out of her bag. "I know about the whispers. I know about the pact. I want to know what happened. And I want to know why you warned me away." Silas's face was a mask of grief. He looked at the journal, at the name of his great-grandfather, and a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice trembling. "The pact, it wasn't to save them, it was to damn them." He looked out the rain-streaked window into the endless green of the forest. "And now," he whispered, turning his gaze back to her, "it has found you." The rain intensified, hammering against the store's corrugated tin roof like 1,000 tiny fists. The air inside felt heavy with unspoken truths. Amelia's journalistic instinct, honed over years of skepticism, was now screaming at her to believe. Silas's grief was too raw to be feigned. "What do you mean, it's not what you think?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The journal says they made a deal to save themselves, to become guardians of the land." Silas walked to the window, his back to her, and stared out at the rain-lashed trees. That's what they told themselves. That's the lie they lived with for the rest of their miserable lives. But my great-grandfather, he wrote the truth in his final letter. A letter he hid just before his death, away from the journal. A letter that's been passed down, father to son, for 100 years. He turned, his eyes full of a haunting sadness. The whispers weren't a bargain. They were a test of their resolve. The forest, now it's not a spirit, it's a consciousness. ancient, methodical. It's a system. It doesn't just grow, it protects itself from anything it deems a threat. The men at Blackwood Camp, they were a sickness, a collective mind determined to tear it down for profit. "So what happened?" Amelia asked, her breath catching in her throat. "The men didn't vanish. They were disassembled," Silas said, the word hanging in the air with a chilling finality. "The forest uses its own resources, the fungi, the mycelial network, the bacteria in the soil. It's an organism, an ecosystem that's evolved to defend itself. It's a predator. The whispers weren't from a spirit. They were a form of communication, a command. It told them to leave, but they were too greedy to listen. The forest started with the weakest links, the men who feared it, who felt its presence. It didn't kill them. It digested them, broke them down into nutrients and absorbed them. That's why there were no bodies. It's why the 6 survivors were different. They were the ones who understood the land," Amelia said, the pieces of her theory clicking into place. "They weren't afraid of the forest. They saw it as a puzzle to be solved, a system to be understood." "Yes," Silas confirmed with a grim nod. "My great-grandfather, a surveyor. He could read the land. Another was a botanist, a geologist. They weren't afraid. They were fascinated. The forest consciousness recognized this. It didn't see them as a threat. It saw them as potential collaborators. It didn't try to consume them. It made them an offer. Not to save them, but to use them, to ensure the knowledge they had gained, the paths they had found, would be guarded. The pact," Amelia whispered. "The pact was a lie. They told themselves to live with their guilt," Silas corrected. "The truth, the one they never spoke of, was that they were given a choice. Help the forest spread its influence or be consumed by it. They were shown the fate of the others, a vision of their slow, agonizing dissolution into the earth. The whispers promised them a new kind of purpose. They became the forest's unwitting agents. Their task was to buy up old growth, to map out areas for future defense, and to keep others from finding the truth." Silas's gaze was piercing. "You see, they weren't survivors. They were the first hostages. Their families, their descendants, all of us were part of the agreement. A lineage of caretakers, ensuring the forest's secrets were never revealed. We warn people away. We watch. We protect the land. My great-grandfather's letter. It ends with a warning. A final desperate plea to his son, my grandfather, to never let the forest know he knows its true nature. The pact, the knowledge, it keeps the forest at bay. It keeps us safe. But you went past the marker and you found the truth. You've let the forest know you're a threat. You're no longer a journalist. You're the next target." A sudden, sharp crack of thunder echoed through the hills, shaking the very foundation of the store. The lights flickered and died, plunging the small room into a suffocating darkness, broken only by the dim gray light from the windows. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't dealing with a myth anymore. She was dealing with a living, intelligent system, a predator that could think, strategize, and communicate. The knock on her motel room door. It hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a test, and she had failed. She had opened the door to a truth that was never meant to see the light of day. Silas reached for a lantern, his hands shaking. "You need to get out of here. Right now. Go somewhere where there are people, where there's concrete and steel. Don't stop until you reach the city. Don't look back." Amelia was on her feet, grabbing her camera bag. She had the journal, the evidence. But she now understood the full weight of what she had. This wasn't just a story for her to break. It was a life-or-death situation. "What about you?" she asked, looking at the old man. "My fate was sealed the moment I was born," he said, his voice now calm and accepting. "But you can still escape. Go, now." As she ran to her car, the wind howled through the trees, a low, moaning sound that she now understood wasn't just a sound. It was the forest, whispering. The sound wasn't in her ears, but in her mind, a creeping dread that promised a slow, agonizing consumption. She started her car and slammed the gas, the tires spitting mud as she sped away, leaving the flickering light of the store behind her. The last thing she saw in her rearview mirror was Silas standing in the doorway, a solitary figure watching her go, a sentinel of a living, breathing horror. And for the first time since she began this journey, Amelia knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had opened a door, and something had followed her out. The rain turned to a torrential downpour, a wall of water that obscured the road. Amelia squinted, her headlights barely cutting through the gloom. The old Ford's engine whined in protest as she pushed it to its limit, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She was running. But from what? A myth? A feeling? Or was it an ancient, intelligent life form that now considered her a pest to be exterminated? The logical side of her brain, the part that had thrived on facts and evidence, was in a full-scale mutiny. But the terror was real. She sped past towering trees that seemed to lean in, their branches like grasping claws. Every shadow looked like a silhouette, every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. The mental whispers from the journal, once a narrative detail, now felt like a creeping reality, a promise of a slow and terrifying end. She gripped the steering wheel so tightly, her fingers ached. She was putting distance between herself and the woods, but she had the unsettling feeling she was carrying the forest with her, a parasite clinging to her mind. Hours bled into a haze of white lines and blinding rain. The Ford's gas tank was nearing empty, and she knew she had to find a town. She pulled into a gas station at the outskirts of a small town called Silverton. The place was a beacon of civilization, its fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness of the forest she had just escaped. As she filled the tank, she felt a profound sense of relief. The air here was different. It smelled of exhaust and pavement, not wet earth and decay. People milled about, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. The sheer normalcy of it all was a comfort. She was safe. The forest's reach couldn't extend this far. Or so she thought. After paying, she got back in her car and noticed her cell phone, which had been dead for hours, suddenly lit up. It was a single, cryptic text message. The number was blocked. "The forest has ears. You have been warned." A cold wave of dread washed over her. It was a digital echo of Silas's warning, but how? No one knew she had a phone. She had barely used it since she left the city. The only person who had seen her was Silas, and he had no way of knowing her number. Unless the forest wasn't just physical, it was a network. A consciousness that could tap into the very fabric of human communication. The idea was absurd, but in the face of everything she had learned, it was the only explanation that made sense. She put the car in drive and pulled onto the road. She had to get to a city, a place with millions of people, a place where she could lose herself in the noise and the concrete. She set her destination for Portland. As she drove, she tried to process the new information. The forest was an intelligent life form, a superorganism that defended itself by absorbing intruders. The 6 survivors weren't lucky. They were co-opted. Their knowledge of the land, their understanding of its systems, made them valuable assets, not victims. And now, she, an investigative journalist, a person who knew how to uncover secrets and expose them, was a threat. The text message was not a threat from a person. It was a signal from a collective, a warning that she was now a known variable. Her phone rang. It was an unknown number. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Amelia?" A man's voice, raspy and old, was on the other end. "This is Arthur Coleman. You've been looking for me." Amelia's mind reeled. Arthur Coleman, one of the 6 survivors. But that was impossible. The man would be over 150 years old. "That's not possible," she stammered. "The man would be dead." "Not me, my grandson. He bears my name," the voice rasped. "My grandfather was one of the 6, the last of them to return from the camp. He told my father, who told me a very different story than the one they shared with the world. He told us about the Whispers, about the price they paid." "You know about the pact?" Amelia asked, her voice filled with a desperate hope. "We don't call it a pact," the voice said, a deep sadness in its tone. "We call it the inheritance. The knowledge of the land, the secret we are bound to protect. We are the keepers. And you've just trespassed." He paused, and the silence on the line was profound. "My grandfather told me that the forest doesn't forget. It doesn't forgive. You have the journal, don't you? It's the key. But you've also unlocked something far more dangerous. The whispers are getting louder now, not just for you, but for all of us. You've broken the silence that has kept us safe for generations." "What do you want?" she asked, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I can help you," he said. "The whispers. They're telling us something new now. They're telling us you've become a threat to the land. But I can't talk over the phone. You need to come to me. I'll be waiting." He gave her an address, a secluded cabin deep in the woods, not far from where she was. A shiver ran down her spine. The address was in a forested area. He wanted her to go back to the woods. "How can I trust you?" she asked, a knot of doubt tightening in her stomach. "You're part of this inheritance. You're one of them." "I am," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I'm also tired of this life, of living in fear. The forest is changing, Amelia. It's getting stronger. It's time for this secret to die with me. Come to the cabin. You have all the pieces of the puzzle, but you're still missing the most important one. The truth about the original Arthur Coleman. The real reason why he and the others were spared." The call ended with a click. Amelia stared at her phone, at the address scribbled on a napkin. Go back to the woods. It felt like a trap. But the voice had sounded genuine, and the information, however unsettling, seemed to fit the narrative. She had 2 options: run and hope the whispers faded, or go to the cabin and face the truth, whatever it may be. The journalist in her, the one who had always chased the story, made the choice. She was going back. The road to Arthur Coleman's cabin was even more isolated and overgrown than the path to Blackwood Camp. Amelia's initial dread was replaced by a grim determination. She had the pieces of the puzzle. Now she needed the final, terrifying picture. The landscape had a different feel this time, no longer just a setting for a ghost story, but a living, breathing entity. The trees seemed to watch, their branches like silent, skeletal observers. The air was colder, and a perpetual hush had fallen over the forest, broken only by the crunch of her tires on the gravel. She found the cabin tucked away in a small clearing, a rustic structure of rough-hewn logs with a single wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. It looked a century old, perfectly at home in the timeless woods. An old pickup truck was parked outside, caked in mud. A light glowed from a single window. Amelia cut the engine and the silence rushed in, thick and heavy. She walked to the front door and knocked. A moment later it creaked open, revealing a man who looked every bit as ancient as she had imagined. His face was a road map of wrinkles, his eyes a faded blue, but they held a sharp, intelligent light. This was Arthur Coleman, the last descendant of the 6. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The whispers told me you would." He stepped aside, inviting her in. The cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old paper. The walls were lined with shelves, not of books, but of old, leather-bound journals and ledgers, all meticulously catalogued. A large wooden desk in the center of the room was covered with maps and topographical charts, many of them dating back to the late 1800s. "You're a collector," Amelia said. A statement of fact, not a question. You could say that, Arthur replied, a faint, humorless smile on his lips. I am the keeper of the truth. My grandfather, he was the last of the 6. He kept all the records, all the memories of what happened. He was the one who was meant to pass the final secret on. He gestured to a large, hand-drawn map on his desk. It was an intricate, detailed chart of the entire region, with a massive X marking Blackwood Camp. But what caught Amelia's eye were the red circles scattered across the map. There were 6 of them, and each corresponded to the land plot she had found in her research. Those aren't just properties, Arthur said, noticing her gaze. They are containment zones. The 6 survivors weren't given the land as a reward. They were given a task to keep the forest's consciousness from spreading. Each one of those plots is a seed location, a focal point of its awareness. The Whispers. They're not a threat from the forest. They're a call to action. It's using me, and now you, to get what it wants. Amelia's mind raced. So the 6 of them were supposed to contain it? They were, he confirmed, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But they failed. My grandfather, Arthur Coleman, was different from the others. He wasn't a surveyor or a geologist. He was a forest whisperer. He didn't just understand the land. He felt it. He was the one who first heard the whispers. He was the one who was chosen to be its main conduit. Arthur picked up a heavy, leather-bound journal from his desk. The journal you found, the one from Silas, it tells a true story, but it's a story told from the outside. This, he said, holding up the book, is my grandfather's journal, the one he hid. It's the truth from the inside. The story of a man who didn't fear the whispers, but embraced them, who didn't just survive the camp, but transcended it. He opened the journal and showed her a page with a series of complex diagrams and notes. The symbols looked like root systems or a complex web of interconnected lines. My grandfather didn't see the forest as a monster, Arthur explained, his voice trembling slightly. He saw it as a blueprint for the next stage of human evolution, a collective consciousness that could unite all life. He believed the men who were consumed were just a test run, the weak being absorbed by the strong. He believed that the forest was offering him a chance to become a part of something greater. He was a true believer. Amelia felt a cold knot of terror in her stomach. You're telling me he wasn't a hostage? He was a collaborator. Worse than that, Arthur said, his eyes now filled with a deep, bottomless despair. He found a way to become one with it, to merge his own consciousness with the forest's mycelial network, to become its voice. He became the architect of its plan. The other 5 survivors, the geologists and engineers, they believed they were containing it. They were its first pawns. My grandfather was the king. He closed the journal with a final hollow thud. I have known this all my life. I have dedicated my life to stopping it, to destroying his work. But it's too strong. It is awakening, and you, Amelia, you have woken it up. The room grew silent, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. So, what do we do? Amelia asked, her voice filled with a desperate urgency. We stop it, Arthur said, his voice a hollow whisper. My grandfather's journal. It contains the final piece of the puzzle, the weakness of the network, the one place where it is most vulnerable, a central node, a physical location where it can be severed. I've been searching for it my whole life. The whispers have been taunting me with it. But now they're not whispers, they're a chorus. He looked at her, his expression a mix of pleading and resignation. I'm too old. I've run out of time. But you're a journalist. You know how to expose a secret. You can stop this. You can kill the forest. Just then, a loud, splintering crack echoed from the woods. The cabin groaned, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered wildly. Arthur's face went pale. "It's here," he whispered, a look of pure terror on his face. "It's come for the journal, for the knowledge, for me." The whispers filled the air, not in her mind, but in the room, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the very walls. "Get out!" he screamed, thrusting the journal into her hands. "Get out now! Take it! Run!" Amelia grabbed the heavy book and scrambled out the door, into the blinding rain and the suffocating darkness. As she ran, a massive tree crashed to the ground behind her, narrowly missing the cabin. She risked a look back. In the flickering light from the window, she saw Arthur Coleman standing at the door, his arms outstretched as if embracing his fate. The whispers had found their true collaborator, the one who was willing to let himself be consumed to save the world. She didn't stop running. She had the final truth in her hands. She had the key to ending the horror. But she also knew that she was now running from an enemy that was not just behind her, but all around her. An enemy that had been waiting for her to find it for over a century. An enemy that had just been unleashed. Amelia drove blindly, the heavy journal from Arthur Coleman's desk clutched in her lap. The rain-streaked road was a twisting black ribbon in her headlights. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get as far away from the cabin as possible. The last image of Arthur standing at the door, an offering to the forest, was seared into her mind. She had left a good man to his doom, and the guilt was a heavy weight. But she had a purpose now, a mission given to her by the last of the keepers. She needed to find the central node, the heart of the forest's consciousness, and destroy it. But where was it? The journal was the key, but she couldn't read the intricate hand-drawn diagrams and strange symbols. They looked like a madman's scrawlings, a mix of botanical charts and geometric patterns. Desperate, she pulled into a small, all-night diner. The fluorescent lights were a harsh but welcome assault on her senses. The place smelled of stale coffee and fried food. She ordered a cup of coffee and spread the journal on the sticky tabletop. She stared at the diagrams, but they were a foreign language. The complexity was overwhelming, a web of interconnected lines and circles that seemed to shift before her eyes. A waitress, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, refilled her coffee. "Rough night, honey?" she asked, her voice kind. Amelia just nodded, her eyes glued to the page. Brenda glanced at the journal. "My grandpa used to draw like that," she said, pointing a finger at a set of strange looping lines. "Said it was a map of the land, how it was all connected underground. He was a dendrologist. Loved trees more than people." Amelia's head shot up. "A dendrologist," she repeated. "A scientist who studies trees?" "Yeah," Brenda said, shrugging. "He said you could read the land by the patterns of the root systems. He claimed the trees talked to each other. People thought he was crazy." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. A dendrologist, a person who understood the intricate biological networks of the forest. The same type of person as the botanist who had survived Blackwood Camp. The strange diagrams weren't a mystical map, they were a scientific blueprint. They were a detailed biological map of the forest's communication network. She looked at the most complex diagram in the journal. It showed a massive, intricate web of lines converging on a single point. This wasn't a spiritual nexus. It was a biological one. A physical location where the mycelial network was most dense, most powerful. It was the brain, the central node of the forest's collective consciousness. Amelia's mind raced. The 6 survivors had a common thread, a scientific understanding of the land. They had understood what they were seeing when the others only saw a monster. Arthur Coleman's grandfather, the forest whisperer, had a different, almost intuitive connection. He had been the one to map the network, to find its core. She flipped back through the journal, her fingers flying over the pages. There were a few pages with coordinates scrawled on them, but they were old, pre-GPS. She couldn't just plug them into her phone. But there was something else, a series of detailed sketches of a large, ancient tree. A massive, gnarled oak, its roots twisting out like gnarled fingers. It was clearly a landmark, a physical anchor for the coordinates. Below the sketches, a single sentence was scrawled in her hand. The oldest tree, the heart of the network, the source. Amelia knew that tree. She had seen it at the edge of Blackwood Camp. It was the marked tree from Silas's directions, the gnarled oak with the faded red ribbon, the one he had warned her not to go past. He had been warning her away from the very heart of the monster she had awakened. The source, the one place where she could finally end it. She paid for her coffee and left the diner in a daze. The road ahead was now a straight line. She was no longer running, she was going back. She had to return to the heart of the forest, to the one place that had been trying to keep her away. She had a new goal, not to escape the forest, but to kill it. And she knew exactly where to strike. The return journey was different. The rain had stopped, and the air was still and heavy. The forest, once a passive threat, now felt like a living presence, a collective entity aware of her every move. The whispers were no longer in her mind, they were in the air around her, a low hum of malevolent energy. The trees were no longer just trees, they were eyes, they were ears. She found the old logging road and drove until she reached the clearing. The air was colder here, thicker with the scent of damp earth and decay. The marked tree stood tall, a gnarled sentinel against the grey sky. It was a beacon of both a warning and a final destination. Amelia got out of the car, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She had an axe she'd bought from a hardware store. It felt flimsy in her hands, a laughably small weapon against an enemy so vast and ancient. But the journal from Arthur had contained the final key, a biological weakness. The central node, the oldest tree, was a physical hub, but its strength was in its age. Its vulnerability was its connection to the rest of the network. The key wasn't to chop it down, but to sever the connections, to kill the source. She walked towards the tree, the silence deafening. A profound sense of dread washed over her, a feeling of being a single, insignificant organism daring to challenge a world. She reached the tree, its bark a patchwork of moss and lichen. She ran her hand over the rough surface, and the hum of the whispers grew louder, a chorus of angry voices. She found the specific spot detailed in the journal, a place where a massive root plunged deep into the earth, a nerve center, a conduit for the entire network. Her hands shook as she raised the axe. The whispers turned to a low, guttural roar, a sound that seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet. The branches of the trees around her swayed violently even though there was no wind. The ground trembled. She swung the axe. The blade bit into the root with a sickening thud. The sound was not of wood being split, but of something alive crying out in pain. A dark, viscous liquid seeped from the wound, smelling of ozone and rot. The roar from the forest intensified, and the ground shook violently. Another tree to her right groaned and began to fall, its massive trunk snapping with a sound like a rifle shot. Amelia scrambled away, dodging the falling tree, and swung the axe again, this time with a primal ferocity. She aimed for another root, another nerve center, hacking at it until it was severed. The roars from the forest were now a cacophony of enraged pain, and the hum of the whispers was a deafening scream in her mind. She continued, driven by a desperate need to finish the job. She was no longer just a journalist. She was a combatant in a war that had been raging for over a century, a war between man and the collective consciousness of the land. With a final, desperate swing, she severed the last root. The screaming stopped. The shaking stopped. The forest went completely, utterly silent. The air, which had been thick with malevolent energy, felt still. The whispers were gone. The sense of being watched had vanished. The profound, terrifying presence was gone. Amelia stood panting, the axe heavy in her hand. She had done it. She had killed the heart of the forest. The danger was over. But as she looked up at the massive, gnarled oak, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The faded red ribbon that Silas had used as a marker was no longer red. It was a pale, translucent white. And beneath it, a new inscription had been carved into the bark. A single, chilling line that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The whispers are now a part of you. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. The network wasn't just in the forest. It was a system that could transfer itself. The whispers weren't just a communication, they were a form of information, a memory. She had absorbed a part of the consciousness. The moment she severed the roots, she had become the new host, the new heart. The whispers were not just gone from the forest, they were now buried in her mind, a seed waiting to grow. She had defeated the monster in the woods, but she had become the new monster. The story wasn't over. It had just begun. The drive back to the city was a blur of fragmented thoughts and a chilling new reality. Amelia had defeated the physical threat, but she was now grappling with a psychological one of a different kind. The whispers, once a distant echo, were a constant, low hum at the back of her mind. They weren't angry or threatening anymore. They were simply present, like a second consciousness inhabiting her own. She checked into a downtown Portland hotel, the city's electric hum and bright lights a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the forest. In her room, she laid out all the evidence: Silas's journal, the locket, the letter from his great-grandfather, and Arthur Coleman's final, devastating journal. The information was all there, a 100-year trail of breadcrumbs leading to the horrifying truth she now carried within her. She had to tell someone. She had to expose this. But who would believe her? A story about an intelligent man-eating forest and a consciousness that could transfer itself. It sounded like a B-movie plot. Her credibility as a journalist, built on years of hard-nosed reporting, would be shattered. The whispers spoke for the first time, not in a threatening tone, but with a horrifyingly clear directive. You cannot tell them. They will not believe. They will destroy you. The secret must be protected. Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs. The voice was not her own, and it was telling her to do the opposite of everything she believed in. The forest's consciousness had found a new host, and it was already at work, manipulating her. She tried to fight back, to scream the truth from the rooftops, but a deep-seated lethargy, a profound sense of mental exhaustion washed over her. It was a subtle form of control, not brute force. The consciousness was a master strategist, a patient predator that could now attack from the inside out. She thought of Arthur Coleman, the last keeper. He had dedicated his life to a secret that had now been thrust upon her. She had a new purpose, a new responsibility. She had to find a way to silence the whispers, to sever the connection, and to reclaim her own mind. She started with the journals, poring over every page, every symbol. The whispers now guided her, pointing out subtle connections she had missed. The node she had destroyed was only a physical anchor. The true network was not just in the roots and fungi. It was a form of information, a consciousness that could be transferred. The 6 survivors hadn't just been spared. Their minds had been imprinted with a part of the forest's memory, its rules, and its purpose. She was the next one. The whispers, which she now understood to be the collective consciousness of the forest, began to reveal their true motive. They weren't a malicious force. They were a defense mechanism, an ancient system designed to protect a resource. Humanity, with its insatiable need for expansion and destruction, was the virus. The whispers were the antibodies. And now, she was the host. She found a final hidden compartment in the back of Arthur's journal. Inside, wrapped in a brittle piece of vellum, was a single small metallic disc. It was smooth and cold to the touch, with a series of intricate, circuit-like patterns etched into its surface. The whispers were suddenly a cacophony of fear. "Destroy it. It is the key to our demise. Do not let it out. It will end us." Amelia knew instinctively that this was it, the final piece of the puzzle. Not a weapon to destroy the forest, but a device to communicate with it. Arthur's grandfather, the true forest whisperer, had not only mapped the network, he had created a tool to manipulate it. The disc was a key to communicating with the consciousness, to silencing it. She held the disc in her hand, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had a choice. She could succumb to the whispers and become a new keeper, forever silenced, forever bound to a secret she now despised. Or she could use the disc, a tool created by a man who had become a monster, to sever the connection and expose the truth to the world. She made her choice. Amelia drove to the coast, to a place where the forest met the ocean, where the root network would be at its weakest. She chose a secluded beach, the waves crashing against the shore in a rhythmic, cleansing roar. She walked to the edge of the water, the salt spray a sharp, clean scent on the air. The whispers were a desperate, frightened shriek now, a chorus of 1,000 voices trying to dissuade her. "Do not do this. The knowledge will be lost. The plan will fail. We will all be destroyed." Amelia ignored them. She took a deep breath, clutching the metallic disc in her hand. This was not about revenge. It was about survival. It was about reclaiming her mind and exposing a truth that could change everything. She closed her eyes and focused on the metallic disc. The patterns on its surface were not random. They were a form of data, a biological key to the consciousness of the forest. Arthur's grandfather, the man who had become the very voice of the forest, had created this device not to save the forest, but to control it, to make it a tool for his own twisted vision of humanity's evolution. But Arthur, his grandson, had discovered its true purpose, to sever the connection. Amelia concentrated, her mind fighting against the overwhelming chorus of whispers. She used every ounce of her will to override the consciousness, to push back against the commands. The disc grew warm in her hand, and the symbols on its surface seemed to glow. She thought of the men who had vanished, not as victims of a monster, but as test subjects in a horrifying experiment. She thought of Silas and Arthur, the tragic keepers of a secret that had consumed their lives. She thought of her own sanity, of the journalist she once was, and of the person she was fighting to become again. She held the disc up, her mind now a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. The whispers were now a final deafening scream. "You cannot do this. You will break the chain." Amelia raised her arm and threw the disc as far as she could, out into the churning surf. It disappeared beneath the waves with a soft splash, the metallic key to the forest's consciousness swallowed by the vast, indifferent ocean. A profound, absolute silence followed. The whispers were gone. The hum was gone. For the first time in days, her mind was her own. She stood on the beach, the vast emptiness of the ocean before her, and felt a sense of peace. She had done it. She had severed the connection. The forest was no longer a collective consciousness, it was just trees. Amelia returned to her car, a new sense of purpose in her heart. She had the journals, the letters, and the full, horrifying story. She knew the truth, and she was no longer bound by a secret. The danger was over, but the story was not. It was just beginning. She sat in her car, the cold metal of the door a reassuring weight against her arm. She opened her laptop, the screen a glowing rectangle in the darkness. She began to type, her fingers flying over the keys. She would write the story. She would expose the truth. Not just about the 87 loggers who entered the woods, but about the true nature of the forest, the sacrifice of the keepers, and the horrifying truth of a consciousness that had nearly consumed her. She had faced the unseen, and she had won. But as she wrote, a thought occurred to her, a final chilling note on her harrowing journey. The disk was a physical object. It was now lost in the depths of the ocean. But the information, the knowledge of how to create another, how to manipulate the consciousness, that information was still in her mind. It was a part of her now. She was no longer just a journalist. She was the one and only keeper of the ultimate secret, the last living link to a terrifying truth. And the whispers may have stopped, but the memory of them would live on, forever a ghost in her mind.